St. Petersburg, March 28, 1897, was an absolute disaster for classical composer Sergei Rachmaninoff. It was the first performance of his Symphony No. 1 in D minor, and above the criticism Rachmaninoff received from fellow composer Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakoff, who said of the symphony, "Forgive me, but I do not find this music at all agreeable," was the fact that the conductor, Glazunov, was drunk. And before the end of the convoluted and cut performance, Rachmaninoff had fled the concert hall and found himself panic-stricken in the street. So horrified at the virulent criticisms he received from other fellow composers the next day, he would shut himself away and wouldn't create another piece of work for 2 years. He had a creative block. Hello, and welcome to Your Art Sucks, a podcast that wants to help you create better art. Whether you're a writer, painter, sculptor, actor, designer, architect, or musician, this podcast is here to help, and you are listening to the first episode of Season 3, Creative Block. Many artists, many ways. Thank you so much for being here. In this episode, I will be addressing the monster that is called the creative block. All artists, at some point in their career, have experienced this drought in their process, and I'm sure you have as well. While some of these periods can be brief, a day or two, there have been blocks that have lasted years, tormenting the artist, and in the worst cases, having them turn away permanently from their true path. Yes, the pain, for some, has been that unbearable. Regardless of the level of block you have experienced or the reason for it, and as we'll hear, there's plenty of those, I'll do my best to bring to you the stories from a multitude of artists and what they've done to alleviate this dreaded foe. My goal, by the end of this episode, is to give you at least a handful of techniques or suggestions you can use when these situations arise. Please understand, though, that no one method is proven to work every time. Creative blocks can be attributed to a variety of underlying issues, so you're best to try different methods to see what works for you. Just know it may not work the next time. Now, how about I start with breaking down on what exactly is a creative block so that we can all be on the same page? Creative block, a condition primarily associated with writing, although is prevalent in all mediums, is one in which the artist loses the ability to produce new work or experiences a creative shutdown. Interestingly, the term writer's block itself was first introduced into the academic literature in the 1940s, and that was done by a psychiatrist named Edmund Bergler. For 2 decades, Bergler studied writers who suffered from what he clinically called neurotic inhibitions of productivity. Regardless of what you want to call it, writer's block or creative block, the condition ranges in difficulty from coming up with original ideas to being unable to produce art for several periods of days or years. It's a well-documented problem that has plagued artists from the very beginning of time, and will continue to do so as long as artists exist. While this may sound dreadful, I believe that such challenges are far more necessary to the artistic process than one may think. In fact, I think they're essential. Why? Well, that's simple. Without an interruption in your process, we as artists, we'd never grow. We would never experience doubt or pause to create enough space in our thoughts to allow other inspirations to flow in. Without block, our work would eventually lose momentum, and we'd find ourselves without passion or purpose. I can succinctly state that when art becomes mechanical, a soulless process of churning out product, the artist becomes nothing more than a machine. So allow us to think of creative blocks as a means to ensure your work is true to your calling. The measure of how engaged you are in the process, it is not something to be feared or avoided. It's something to be embraced. With this in mind, let's begin to look at how artists have found themselves on the other side of this process and have broken through the barriers they've faced. Maybe I should start with why I feel the need to do this episode. I mean, outside the obvious nature of creative blocks and their impacts on all artists. In doing research for this podcast, I came across the life of Herman Melville. He was the author of Moby Dick. For those of you who don't know, Melville was plagued by writer's block for years while attempting to create this masterpiece. It's been noted that Herman he'd become extremely abusive to family and friends during these really rough times. He was almost driven mad by the many blocks that routinely interrupted his workflow. The white page, much like the white whale in his novel, enraged him with its presence. And like his Captain Ahab, Herman fought an epic battle to rein in the creative inspiration that struggled at the end of his fishing line. While he was eventually successful in breaking through, for reasons that no one was able to document, the madness did appear to take up permanent presence in his art and life. While Herman didn't try this method, what may have been helpful for him is what our first artist does. It's the first of 5 methods I'm going to talk about today, and I like to call it go with the no flow. The first thing I want you to take note of is that in order for this method to work for you, you must do one important thing. Don't resist. When you begin to experience the sudden lapse of inspiration, please don't immediately tense up and panic. To do so will cause our brain to shut down and regress. There are negative physiological changes that occur within the body seconds after stress and fear appear. All of these are entirely contrary to the creative flow of energy. So first and foremost, relax. Poet Maya Angelou suffers from occasional blocks, and when she does, she applies the wisdom that continued writing, however nonsensical, will allow her to dislodge that block. She says this, "What I try to do is write. I may write for 2 weeks. I may write the cat sat on the mat. That is that, not a rat. And it might just be the most boring and awful stuff. So I keep writing, and I write. And then it's as if the muse just is convinced that I'm serious about writing and says, okay, I'll come back." What we see in this first method is twofold. First is to not associate the act of doing the art with something negative. Too many times I've read accounts of artists who suffer block the instant they begin to use their tools. For musicians, this would start the moment they pick up their instrument. For artists, their brush or digital pen. For actors, it may be the second that they get on stage or begin to speak lines on a set. The most important thing to note is to not let the block become something other than a pause in thought. It's not a physical object. It can't manifest itself in the physical realm. Let's not give it the power to cling to material items. The second aspect of this method would be to continue to create art for the purpose of continuity. Don't break your habits. Keep producing as you normally would, but do not give the work any focus or direction. Don't force it to be anything. Allow yourself to just simply work away. Maya writes nonsensical words. A painter may just slap paint around on a canvas. An actor may just move their body and speak gibberish. However it manifests itself, it's vital that you keep the structure you built for yourself active. So stick to your routine. And, after some indeterminate amount of time, the muse will show up just as Maya says. But what if, by chance, that elusive muse just doesn't show? Well, then how about we listen to another method to break through that creative barrier? This one is interesting in that it has been studied by a pair of scientists at Yale University, and they found it to be very practical in removing creative droughts. Now, don't dismiss this right away, as it may sound a bit, pre-teenish. But I can tell you, it was used very successfully by one of the greatest writers of the 20th century, and that was Graham Greene. If you're not aware of Greene, he was able to write 25 novels in his time. He's also shortlisted twice for the Nobel Prize for Literature. So you would assume that someone so prolific and talented would not have had issues with creative blocks. But you couldn't be more wrong. Greene was very familiar with periods in his life where he struggled to write even a single sentence. But Graham had a secret weapon he pulled out whenever these moments occurred. And what was his weapon? Well, it was a dream journal. When Graham was quite young, his family had sent him to a psychotherapist due to his recent escape from a prep school. Now, Graham wasn't running home from a strict boarding school because he missed his family. No, he was escaping a board school where his father was the headmaster. Basically, his father ran the school. Now, his reasoning came down to this. He said, 104 weeks of monotony, humiliation, and mental pain, he could no longer remain there. Now, that seems very reasonable to me, but I wasn't his parents, and this did take place in the 1920s. Fortunately for Green and his fan base, this time in therapy proved very fruitful. He learned that in order to deal with his thoughts, he would make very detailed notes of his dreams each and every night. This allowed him to escape his environment and its impact on him to fantasize about a life beyond the school, beyond his father, and beyond the limitations of his hometown. Well, it benefited him greatly. In his own words, he says this of his process. If one can remember an entire dream, the result is a sense of entertainment sufficiently marked to give one the illusion of being catapulted into a different world. One finds oneself remote from one's conscious preoccupations. And in that freedom, Green found the ability to do what he otherwise couldn't, and that was to continue writing. The success Green found in his journal also came up when Jerome Singer and Michael Barrios, the Yale psychiatrist I was mentioning earlier, they tried to gain more of an empirically grounded understanding of what it meant to be creatively blocked. While their study was very involved and utilized multiple groups of varying conditions of this issue, they came to a very important conclusion. The act of visualization had a very positive impact on the artists who suffered from blocks. If they were provided material that allowed them to think differently or in a non-linear fashion, they were more prone to be inspired. Green's dream journal accomplished this by providing imagery for him to review and contemplate. It was an exercise almost meditative in its methodology. While the exercise didn't cure the block across the board, it did seem to demonstrate to the creatively stymied that they were still capable of creativity. Again, this is just a method. There's no cure for the creativity obstructions that we experience. But this method does seem to have some scientific credence to it. Now, if the idea of a dream journal just doesn't appeal to you, then maybe you need a little something more rebellious, something more spicy. Well, we only have to look to the artist who spent his life breaking all the rules, our friend Pablo Picasso. If you're a regular listener of this podcast, you know that Pablo was the subject of another episode. Well, that show was not flattering. This time his inclusion will have more of a benefit to you, the artist. For this method, let's listen to what Pablo said to others when asked if he ever experienced creative block. He stated firmly, he said, learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. Rules, for Picasso, didn't necessarily mean the rules he learnt as a painter or as a sculptor, although they were important for him to break as well. Pablo was brilliant enough to understand that life itself prevented rules in the shape of culture or religion, political or familial. Each of these aspects were impacting the creative process in some meaningful way, whether subconscious or overt. These rules would surface to the point of creating a block to which creativity just couldn't pass through. I can tell you that in the many years I've studied artists, there were far too many times that an artist would avoid certain subjects for fear of the weight that they held in their lives. They feared backlash or alienation from their peers or relations. It painted them into a corner quite literally. Only the artists who were truly free could express themselves in a way that may cause strife or conflict, but their inspiration was rife and palpable. Where some found the inability to create in the face of many rules, others found such rules transparent and were means to draw attention to their work. And it is here that Pablo is focusing his statement. Rules to him only serve to create a cage that does nothing but inhibit the artist. What good were rules but to stifle creativity and impose unrealistic regulations? If you don't feel that you suffer blocks due to rules, I would ask that before you dismiss this method outright, do a deep dive on your life and find out how, outside of your studio, these rules impact you and your creativity. You may be surprised to find that many of your held beliefs are not actually your own. They may be the reason why you're not able to accept inspiration from sources foreign to you or your immediate environment. If you find rules have been present in your processes all along without you knowing, then you owe yourself a duty to break them as soon as possible. Failure to do so will most certainly hamper your ability to absorb new influences and will severely limit your potential. If you allow rules to dominate your art, you'll find yourself more susceptible to blocks that will last a far longer period of time. If we step away from the impact of rules on our processes, I would like to introduce the next method you could use when faced with blocks. This method, I believe, slightly contradicts the process Maya Angelou utilizes, but it can be equally as effective. And it's most likely the method you would first turn to when faced with such a difficult time. Simply put, the method is to just leave your creative space and allow yourself to re-enter the world. And that's it. Just escape the block by not actively engaging with it. The great thing about this method is that it's readily available to all artists and, by nature, fits with most personality types without much resistance or preparation. English writer Dame Hilary Mantel, a 2-time Booker Prize winner, found that leaving her writing space and integrating with the world that constantly spins around her was a great means of moving forward when inspiration left her. She said, "If you get stuck, get away from your desk. Take a walk. Take a bath. Go to sleep. Make a pie. Draw. Listen to music. Meditate. Exercise. Whatever you do, don't just sit there scowling at the problem. But don't make telephone calls or go to a party. If you do, other people's words and ideas will pour in where your lost words should have been. Open a gap for them. Create a space. And most of all, be patient." Now, I have to agree with Hillary. I have personally used this process, and the key here is to be mindful of your activity. Allow yourself to fully engage in an activity that gives you space from the block. Some artists have felt that immersing themselves in mundane tasks was the perfect recipe for alleviating the stress that follows these arid periods. Remember the episode I did not long ago, I believe it was in the first season, where I talked about artists who had day jobs. And I think that's why they had day jobs. It's because those mundane processes that most of them did, well, they allowed them to create free space in the brain. They could work out the creative blocks while they were getting paid. Now, another artist I've also featured in this podcast, Neil Gaiman, he's the award-winning graphic novelist and author. He also uses a variant of the escape method, but he calls it hibernation. When he hits a block with his writing, he says to put it, meaning your art, aside for a few days, or longer. Do other things. Try not to think about it. Then sit down and read it. He finds printouts work best for him. Read it as this is the first time you've ever seen it. Start at the beginning. Scribble on the manuscript as you go and see if there's anything there that you want to change. And often, when you get to the end, you'll be both enthusiastic about it and know what the next few words are. And you'll do it one word at a time. Now, while Neil speaks of writing, the advice is the same for all artistic pursuits. The medium you're working in has little influence over any of the methods I'm talking about in this episode. Now, finally, I want to point to a method that may be of value to you when all other methods so far have either failed to push you through the wall or have not spoken to you in a meaningful way. I left this one until last because I feel that it can be a bit hit or miss. But through research, I found that many famous artists have used a variation of this process in their search for a complete breakthrough. But Salvador Dali said it best when he spoke of the method. He called it the irrational approach and said that in order to practice it, you have to systematically create confusion. Because he believed creating confusion, well, it set creativity free. He said everything that is contradictory creates life. I found other versions of this method, and some were called the exquisite corpse, or some were called the oblique strategy. But the basic premise with all of these systems is to promote creativity by connecting thoughts or words or images together that don't rationally belong together. It's a very free form of a game that can spark imagination and allow an element of fun into your day. Now, you may not be quite sure on how you'd go about playing this game. Well, here's some examples. If you are interested in doing this with words like William S. Burroughs and the poet Charles Bukowski have done, and they did it with great success, then either write out or print out a slew of random words. Cut each of these words out and toss them out in front of you. Your job is to now, without thought, grab words and put them together. They most likely won't make any sense, but the imagery they provoke, that's been the impetus for many writers to create poems and short stories. For Burroughs, he created a series of poems called Minutes to Go with this exact method. Now, if you're interested in doing this with images, then you can use a type of collage process like Cubist painter George Braque, or a more modern version like photomontage like artist Richard William Hamilton used. This could even be the decoupage technique Matisse used when he created his paper cutouts. All of these techniques will provide you the same result, and that is to allow you a complete sense of freedom to play shapes, colors, and images together in ways that, well, hopefully, make no sense whatsoever. In fact, if you find yourself producing stuff that's just too rational, then do yourself a favor and scrap it and start over. Be more inquisitive and childlike. Be less practical and less rigid. Forget what you know. But most importantly, have fun. I do want to add here that regardless of the results, I would implore you to keep these pieces. Lock them away and return to them when need arises. You may find that the very act of looking at them will free you, whether it's a week from now or 10 years from now. But they could be the answer to opening up that block. Now, before I wrap this episode up, allow me to finish the story that you heard at the top of the show about Rachmaninoff, and also provide you with a bonus method to break your block. If you remember, Rachmaninoff was tormented by how poorly his first symphony went. So how did he overcome his deep-seated block, the one he endured for years after this brutal concert? Well, with the urging of his family and friends, he sought help by using hypnotic therapy with Dr. Nikolai Dahl. Between January and April 1900, Rachmaninoff underwent hypnotherapy and psychotherapy sessions with Dahl on a daily basis. Specifically, the doctor structured to improve his sleep patterns, his mood, his appetite, and reignite his desire to compose. Now, that same summer, Rachmaninoff felt that he had new musical ideas just begin to stir in his body, and he successfully resumed composition. His first fully completed work, the Piano Concerto No. 2, was finished in April 1901. It's dedicated to Dahl. After the first and last movement premiered in December 1900, with Rachmaninoff as the soloist, it was enthusiastically received. The piece earned the composer a Glinka Award, the first of 5 awarded to him throughout his life, and a 500 ruble prize in 1904. So while I may personally balk at the idea of hypnotherapy, it appears that such therapy worked extremely well for Rachmaninoff. And that just goes to show you that there's no one sure way for anyone to overcome their blocks. We have to do what works for us at the time. Okay, well, here we are, the end of the episode. We've covered a number of ways and methods that will be of great usefulness to you when the time comes. And I hope you'll notice that I didn't say if the time comes. The reality is that every artist has experienced some level of impact to their creative flow. And as I mentioned earlier, this isn't something to be afraid of or to stress over. Quite the opposite. You need to have the occasional disruption to your practice. Be smart and embrace the turmoil for as long as that's needed. Use one or all of the methods in this episode. If they don't work, then great, create something that does work for you. There's no limit to the ways one can free themselves from such a rut. The absolute worst thing you can do is fall into that easy trap of self-doubt, panic, and fear. These emotions are all byproducts of a lack of self-belief, which become amplified when these blocks arise. So I encourage you to take an active part in the process. Be patient and allow the space to rise between you and the drought. Allow life to flow in. Allow fun and curiousness to flood your mind. Play games. Do mundane tasks with full focus. Escape your creative space and seek new fertile ground that re-energizes you freely. Sleep and eat and, most importantly, laugh. And do so in abundance. Because if you follow what I'm saying, your creativity will expand beyond limitation. You will reaffirm your commitment to creation. And more than all of this, you will cement your foundation as an artist. No more shaky ground of self-doubt. Now let me leave you with the words of author H. Jackson Brown Jr. He said, "Don't waste your time waiting for inspiration. Begin, and inspiration will find you." Thank you so much for listening to this and any other episode you may have played. To allow me into your creative environment means so much to me. I love the idea that I've played a part, no matter how small, in your lives. I hope I've earned it. And if you like this episode, then I would ask that you please tell your friends about it and share your thoughts on social media. It helps me with visibility and maybe one day allow me to do this full time. So now, stop listening to me and go face whatever block you have. Break through and let nothing prevent you from your calling.